Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of History of English Literature, New Classics to Date. Dear students, today we are going to discuss Romantic poet John Keats. I am Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Cohort University of Science and Technology. Dear students, agenda for today's discussion is that I will give you a concise introduction of John Keats. Then we will see that how his poetry and his character is different from the other romantic poets. Then we will discuss the major works of John Keats, including Endymion, and we will include 3 narrative poems. Along with that, we will discuss an epic, a ballad, and 3 odes, very famous odes of John Keats in this lecture. Then I will give you an overview of Keats' poetry, and we will see the chief characteristics often listed about his poetry. Now let's move toward the first slide. Dear students, he was born on 31st October 1795. He belongs to the second generation of romantic poets, and he was one of the main figures along with Lord Byron and P.B. Shelley. One very thing you will see that his date of birth is 31st October 1795 and he died on 23rd February 1821. You will judge from these 2 dates that he died very early, and he died of tuberculosis when he was only 25 years old. His personal life was full of sorrows, but one very important thing that he was pure poet. We can say that he was the most perfect of all the romantic poets. Now let's move toward the important point about his poetry, that how he was different from the other poets of that very time. He was different from Wordsworth, or unlike Wordsworth, who was totally interested in reforming poetry and upholding the moral laws. That was the chief interest of Wordsworth. Whereas Shelley was advocating impossible reforms, and he was prophesying about the golden age, as we discussed in the lecture about Shelley. Byron was also very different from Keats because he made his poetry a vehicle of strongly self-centered and egoistical nature. And we see that he was discontented with the political system of that time. In the poetry of the Coleridge, we see that he was totally devoted to the supernatural and metaphysical aspect of the poetry, and often he is called as a metaphysician. When we look at the Scott, he was very much relished in storytelling, whereas Keats, we see he was not interested in the social, political, or the other literary turmoils that were happening at that time. And we see that Keats devoted himself entirely or completely to the worship of beauty, and he was devoted to writing poetry because it was very much according to his temperament. He was also different from the poets of the second generation. As I told you, the first one is Lord Byron, and the Byron was by birth a lord, and Shelley, he belonged to an aristocratic family. So we see that Keats was different when we see their background, that Keats came of a poor family. And we see that in his early life, he had to work as a doctor's assistant. But these very things did not stand in the way of his passion for writing poetry. When we look at initial influences on the Keats, we see that he was very much influenced by Spenser, because when he read that Fairy Queen of the Spenser, that rose that passion, that he started writing poetry, and he got that idea of the vast world of poetry. Another thing that because of Spenser's The Fairy Queen, he became interested in the beauty of nature. But his life, as I told you in the beginning, that his life was full of sorrows. So a number of calamities that happened to him, those calamities engulfed him. We can list them like this: that he lost his father when he was only 9 years old. After that, his mother and brother died of tuberculosis, and he himself was suffering from this deadly disease. So, all these misfortunes intensified his disappointment, but by the disappointment in the love for Fanny, whom Keats loved passionately, added to all these things. That misfortune intensified all these calamities. But one very important thing, that he was undaunted, and he published his first volume in 1817. But this very event of publishing his works was not that long, and we see that under the shadow of death and among that terrible sufferings, Keat brought out his last volume of poems in the 1820s, and 1820 is regarded as the living year in the life of John Keats. Now we move toward a little bit description of Endymion, the poem I listed here. This very poem that appeared in 1818, and this is the first long poem, which opened with that memorable lines: "A thing of beauty is joy forever. Its loveliness increases. It will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and sleep, full of sweet dreams, and healthy and quiet breathing." So these very famous lines, that is the beginning of this very poem. And again we see that Keats based this very poem on Greek mythology, and the title, again in this very poem, the title is the shepherd beloved of the moon goddess Selene. But the special thing is that Keats renames Selene as Cynthia. But Keats' contemporary critics severely criticized this very poem, and Keats was very shocked of this criticism. Now let's move towards the other poems. As I mentioned to you in the last slide, that 1820 was that golden time. It was the living year of in the life of John Keats. In this year, we see that he gave us very outstanding poems, or we can list these enduring works like this: that he gave us 3 narrative poems, including Isabella and the Eve of Saint Agnes and Lamia, and the unfinished epic Hyperion is there in this very year. He contributed 3 odes. I will give you the list of these odes in the coming slides. Another important point, La Belle Dame, and Mercy, and few sonnets, very important sonnets he contributed in this very year, and that is the living year. 1820 is the living year of John Keats. So the first poem, Isabella, that was published in 1818, this very poem is also known as the Pot of Basil. It is a narrative poem, and in this poem Keat attempts to present a very repellent and tragic story of Isabella and Lorenzo. It is basically the love story of Isabella and Lorenzo, but a very tragic one, because in this story we see that Isabella's family, they are intending to marry her to some high noble, and we see that Isabella falls in love for Lorenzo, who is one of her brother's employee. And when the brothers learn of this, they murder Lorenzo. The rest of the story of this very narrative poem that revolves around that murder and the reaction of Isabella. In this poem, Keats changed this conventional story into a thing of beauty, and by the means of his fine narrative skill and beautiful phraseology. Another important poem, that is the Eve of Saint Agnes. Again, it is a romantic narrative poem. It consists of 42 Spenserian stanzas, and very common thing which we often see in the poetry of John Keats, that in this poem also he set the whole background in the Middle Ages. So it is one of the perfect of Keats' medieval poems. But the most important thing again, that it is surpassingly beautiful in its description. The other poem which I want to mention to you is Lamia. In this poem again, that is the narrative poem, Keats is narrating the story of a beautiful enchantress whose name is Lamia, and initially she was a serpent. Later on she was turned into a glorious woman. It's basically a love story of Lucius and Lamia. Lucius, a 25 years old boy, but a whole story that ended very tragically, because Apollonius, a philosopher, he reveals the Lamia's true identity at wedding feast of Lucius and Lamia. And then we see that Lamia disappears and Lucius dies of that grief. Now let's move towards the Hyperion. I'm giving you a quick review of all these poems, because all these poems are of great importance, but I'm giving you a bird eye view. This very poem Hyperion, basically it is an abandoned epic poem, because John Keats didn't complete this work, but it is a magnificent fragment. And we see again this very poem is based on Greek mythology, and it is the story that deals with the overthrow of Titans by the young sun god Apollo. This very poem shows the influence of Milton, as we see that in Endymion, that was influenced by Spenser, especially the Spenser's Fairies Queen. Now let's move toward the other important poem, that is Label, Dance and Mercy. It is basically a ballad that captures the spirit of Middle Ages. Very beautiful, haunting melody. But in this poem we see that Keats shows his preoccupation with the love and death. He was very much because he was suffering from tuberculosis. This is the approximately last year, and this suffering was preoccupying him, and other tragedies as we discussed in the early slides. So very much preoccupied with love and death. Though it is a small poem, but it is a most perfect work of art. Let's move towards the odes. Three important odes: Ode to Autumn, Ode to Nightingale, Ode to Grecian Urn. The first very ode, again in this Ode to Autumn, he glorifies nature, and it is very rich, and its colors has never been surpassed. So outstanding ode. The second one, again in this ode we see that he shows his love of sensuous beauty, but there are some touches of pessimism in this very Ode to Nightingale. The third very ode, which is also very important ode, Ode on Grecian Urn. In this ode we see Keats' love for Greek mythology and art. This ode, that it basically ends, as I told you, in Endymion. The beginning is very important, and I recited some of the verses to you. This poem ends with the very memorable lines that are the memorable lines in the whole of Keats' poetry, because in these lines Keats says, "Beauty is truth, and truth beauty. That is all. Ye know on earth, and all ye need to know." So that is the end of this very ode, and basically it gives us the whole philosophy of the poetry of Keats, that is, beauty is truth and truth beauty. Now let's move towards some of the key aspects of his poetry. As I have written to you that most of the romantic poets are often listed as escapist poets, but I believe that he was not an escapist, because he didn't try to run away from the harsh realities of life. We see that he faced life bravely, and in the end we can conclude that sufferings in his life played an important part in the development of his personality. So his poetry is often termed as escapist poetry, as we see most of the romantic poets are listed as escapist poets, but the way he faced the life bravely, that gave us some other feature of his personality. Another important thing is that we see the quest for beauty in his poetry. We see that in most of his poems he loves beauty, and for him a thing of beauty is joy forever, and he creates a fancy world in pursuance of this beauty. But John Keats not only find beauty in nature, the special thing is he finds beauty in art. So his quest is a little bit different from the other poets, because he's not only searching this very beauty in nature, he also find this beauty in arts. One important thing, again I want to give you a note here, that it should be remembered that romantic poets do not seek for perfect world. That is the common thing connected to them. Instead they create it with the help of their imagination. So that is the special thing about romantic poets. Another aspect that as I give you a short intro in the quest for beauty in the poetry of John Keats, another thing is that he is a worshipper of beauty. We see that his approach in the poetry shifted from a sensuous attitude, and later on it became philosophical, because he discovered that there is beauty in everything. And one another important aspect which he highlighted in his poetry, that is that beauty and truth are one. They are not separate identities, they are one thing, and we can't separate them. They are connected into a pair. So the other point important about Keats' poetry is that Keats, as an artist, we see that very few poets, English poets, who come near him. He is outstanding artist. Another important thing that, as I told you in the early slides, that he was not interested in anything else. He was a poet, only a poet. So about poetry, he had very high ideals before him. He wanted to become the poet of a human heart and want to equal himself one with the Shakespeare, as Shakespeare was the poet of human heart. So for him, the role of poetry is to be a friend that soothes the miseries of the life, and the other function of or the role of the poetry is to lift the thought of man. For him, the real poet is that to whom the miseries of the world are the real miseries. I believe that he was not that escapist. He was basically, the ideology of his poetry is very different from the other escapist poets. And we see that in his life, he very sincerely and persistently lived up to the above mentioned ideals. Those are not the simple ideals, very high ideals, and he lived for them. Initially, we see that, as we discussed in the last slides, that initially he was considered as a sensuous poet, having no depth of thought. But later on, when critics read the letters of John Keats, they reinterpreted his poems, and now it has been discovered that that his poetry was based on very mature thoughts, and there is a regular line of development from the point of thought and art. Both the thought has a line of development and his art has that line of development. Now let's move toward the conclusion that he suffered hardships in his life, and he had very short span of life that was given to him by the providence, by Almighty Allah. But it is not exaggeration to say that of all the English poets, he comes nearest to Shakespeare. Age barely the age of 25, and only few years he could effectively write poetry. We see that his achievements are so great that that we wonder that what he might have accomplished if he had lived longer. So that's all for today's discussion, and thank you very much for listening passionately. Inshallah, see you in the next lecture. Thank you very much.